Late September 2024, the Broad River Valley, western North Carolina, 4 days after the remnants of a Category 4 hurricane stalled over the southern Appalachians and dropped more than 2 feet of rain in 72 hours. A search and rescue volunteer, wading through waist-deep debris behind a collapsed outbuilding, is not looking for snakes. She is looking for a missing neighbor's dog. What she finds instead is a row of half-submerged reptile enclosures, lids torn from their frames, the kind of small, unlicensed, exotic pet operation that exists in the gray zone between hobbyist and breeder, unlisted on any state wildlife database. The facility's handwritten inventory sheet, laminated and still legible, lists 11 animals. She counts 4 tanks that are empty, mesh shredded, no bodies inside and none nearby. She reports it. The report goes into a county emergency log, not a wildlife incident file, because at the time, nobody files it as one. It sits there for months. That gap, between what happened and what got recorded, is the shape of everything that follows. State wildlife agencies from Georgia to West Virginia are consistent on this point. There is no established population of giant constrictor snakes anywhere in the Appalachian range. The official inventory of the region's serpents is a native one. Timber rattlesnakes, black racers, eastern rat snakes, copperheads, animals that belong to the mountains by any reasonable evolutionary timeline. Pythons and boas, in the official record, are Florida's problem. Isolated escapees, when they surface this far north, are treated as curiosities. A single confiscated animal, a viral photo, a call to animal control. Case closed, file archived. No further monitoring required. The question worth asking is not whether that official record is dishonest. It almost certainly isn't. The question is whether it is complete, and whether complete was ever a realistic standard for a monitoring system built to track native species, not a slow, unglamorous, multi-decade colonization event happening at the edges of its jurisdiction. 6 documented mechanisms: climate-driven range expansion, storm-driven captive release, microclimate refugia, suburban exurban escape corridors, hybrid vigor, and chronic misidentification are independently well-studied elsewhere in the country. None of them has ever been formally, systematically applied to the Appalachian Range as a connected question. This is an attempt to ask it anyway, case by case. Case 1. The Burmese python's northward creep. The official position, as of the most recent USGS and state agency assessments, draws the python's range ceiling somewhere around the Florida-Georgia line, softening to possible but unconfirmed as you move north into the Piedmont. The python, in this framing, is a subtropical animal, physiologically capped by winter cold, contained by geography as much as by law. The plausibility mechanism is temperature, and temperature is not static. A landmark climate-matching study conducted by USGS researchers in the late 2000s modeled Burmese python habitat suitability using the snake's native range in South and Southeast Asia, and found that under warming projections, suitable habitat could extend far north of Florida, as far as the mid-Atlantic under certain scenarios. That study was controversial. It was also, on the narrow point of physiological plasticity, later reinforced by an unplanned experiment nobody asked for. A hard freeze that hit South Florida in January 2010, killing an estimated large majority of the region's python population in a matter of days. What mattered wasn't the die-off, it was who survived. Post-freeze surveys found disproportionate survival among pythons occupying the deepest, most thermally buffered burrows and drainage structures. The same individuals, researchers noted, most likely to pass that behavioral and physiological cold avoidance trait forward. Selection pressure does not need a hurricane to work. It needs one hard winter every few years, and it needs to happen to a population large enough that the survivors matter. The documented case. In early 2021, a Burmese python measuring just under 13 feet was captured by contract hunters roughly 90 miles north of the species' previously mapped core range in the Everglades, in Charlotte County. Well outside the boundary any 2015-era range map would have drawn. Necropsy found the animal in good body condition, not starving, not disoriented, consistent with successful foraging, rather than a lost or displaced pet. Distance alone does not prove directional migration, but an animal in good condition, 90 miles past the line, is not what a static, contained population looks like. The physical evidence is thermoregulatory. Burmese pythons are heterothermic ambush predators capable of lowering their metabolic rate to near dormancy for weeks, conserving energy the way a hiker conserves water on a long, dry stretch, rationed, not spent, until conditions improve enough to justify the cost of moving. A snake that can wait out a bad month can wait out a bad winter, provided it has somewhere deep enough to wait in. The Appalachian foothills, riddled with limestone cave systems, old mine shafts, and south-facing rock outcrops that hold geothermal heat well above surface air temperature, offer exactly that kind of shelter, at exactly the latitude climate models say the species could eventually reach. The skeptic's objection is straightforward. If the python's range is genuinely creeping north, where are the specimens? The answer sits inside the limits of the search itself. Python surveys in Florida rely heavily on visual detection during nesting season and on trained detector dogs working known high-density corridors, infrastructure that exists nowhere in the Appalachians, because no agency has allocated a budget to look for something its own maps say isn't there. Absence of a coordinated search is not equivalent to absence of the animal. It's not enough to confirm a northern population. It's not enough to dismiss one either. Case 2. Post-flood breeder facility dispersal. The official record on this one is almost entirely silent, and that silence is itself the finding. Wildlife agencies in flood-affected counties across western North Carolina, East Tennessee, and southwest Virginia maintain no centralized post-disaster reptile recovery protocol. Domestic animals get inventoried, livestock gets inventoried. Exotic reptiles from small, unlicensed private collections, the kind that don't require state permitting under many current regulatory frameworks, do not. The mechanism is blunt, and it is the one this investigation opened on. Catastrophic flooding does not discriminate between what it destroys and what it releases. Small-scale exotic breeding operations, often home-based and clustered in rural river valley properties precisely because land is cheap and neighbors are distant, sat directly in the path of the September 2024 flooding across the French, Broad, and Upper Catawba watersheds. An enclosure does not need to fail completely to release its contents. It needs water to rise faster than a lid can be checked. The volunteers' discovery at the outbuilding facility is one data point among what county-level emergency responders describe, off the record, as a recurring pattern that season. Reptile enclosures found breached, animals unaccounted for. No formal wildlife incident report filed because no clear reporting pathway existed for the situation. It was not treated as a wildlife event. It was treated as property damage. Environmental evidence in these cases is necessarily indirect. Trail camera footage from hunters in the weeks after the storm showing unusually large, unidentified serpentine movement in flood debris zones, shed skins recovered by hikers that don't match any documented native species scale pattern, sent to state labs and returned months later as inconclusive, sample degraded. Physical evidence in the aftermath of a flood decomposes at the same rate the flood destroys everything else. A skin left in wet leaf litter for 3 weeks is not a specimen, it's a suggestion. Here is the part of this investigation that sits with you the longest. Every flood season from here forward is another version of this same test. If you've made it this far, subscribe, because this is a channel that keeps watching the cases the agencies file and then quietly close. The skeptic's objection here carries real weight, more than most. Captive-bred giant constrictors, especially animals raised on a feeding schedule from birth, frequently lack the hunting instincts and thermoregulatory behavior to survive more than a few weeks outside an enclosure. Most captive escapees, historically, die of exposure or starvation before they're ever seen again. That is true, and it should temper any claim of an established population arising purely from flood release. But it does not need to be true of all of them. It needs to be false for one gravid female with functional hunting behavior, in one winter, mild enough to let her find shelter before the cold set in. Case 3. Boa constrictor feral pockets. Officially, boa constrictors in the continental United States are confirmed established in exactly one place: a contained, well-studied population in southern Florida's Deering Estate area, tracked since the 1970s. Everywhere else, in the agency record, a boa sighting is an escaped or released pet, full stop, with no capacity for self-sustaining survival implied or investigated. The mechanism proposed here is narrower and, on paper, more speculative than the previous 2 cases. Isolated microclimates. Southern Appalachian foothill country contains numerous thermal spring systems and south-facing cave mouths where year-round ambient temperature sits noticeably above the surrounding forest floor. Refugia already known to host disproportionately dense populations of native reptiles for exactly that reason. A boa constrictor, unlike a python, doesn't need a whole region to warm. It needs a handful of thermally stable acres it never has to leave. Reported incidents here are thinner and more contested than the previous 2 cases. That thinness is the honest state of the evidence, and this investigation isn't going to inflate it. A handful of consistent, independently filed reports over the past decade describe boa pattern snakes in the 4 to 6 foot range near known thermal spring clusters in the southern Blue Ridge. None confirmed by physical capture, all dismissed in agency logs as probable single-animal releases. The physical case for plausibility rests on the boa's reproductive strategy. It bears live young, up to 60, in a single clutch, eliminating the vulnerable incubation period that kills off many failed reptile introductions before they start. Think of it as the difference between a population that has to survive one fragile night in an exposed nest and a population that arrives already born, already moving, already distributed across a landscape, rather than concentrated in one vulnerable point. The skeptic's objection is the correct one to raise, and it is close to fatal for this particular case. A handful of unconfirmed multi-year sightings clustered near a known warm water feature could just as easily represent the same single, long-lived escaped animal, repeatedly seen, rather than a breeding population. That's the honest read. It's not enough to confirm a feral pocket. It's not enough to dismiss the pattern of the sightings either. And patterns, even thin ones, are the reason the next 4 cases exist. Case 4. Reticulated python escapee corridor. The official position treats reticulated pythons, the longest snake species on Earth, regularly exceeding 18 feet in the exotic trade, as an even more remote possibility than Burmese pythons, this far from Florida, given their rarity and private ownership, and the extreme handling requirements that supposedly limit casual acquisition. That rarity is the mechanism's weak point and its strength at once. Reticulated pythons are genuinely uncommon as pets, but they are not absent from the exotic trade, and where suburban sprawl presses directly against Appalachian foothill forest, the exurban ring northeast of Atlanta being the clearest example, where subdivisions now back directly onto national forest boundary lines that didn't exist 20 years ago. Private exotic ownership concentrates in exactly the population density, where an escape is both more likely and less likely to be reported to state wildlife authorities, rather than quietly absorbed as a private loss. A 2019 incident in a Forsyth County, Georgia subdivision, roughly 6 miles from Chattahoochee National Forest boundary land, involved a reported 12-foot snake matching reticulated python coloration, seen crossing a cul-de-sac at dusk by 2 independent households before disappearing into a wooded drainage easement. No capture followed. The animal was never recovered, and the case was logged as unconfirmed. Environmental evidence in exurban corridor cases tends to show up as absence rather than presence, a documented, unexplained decline in local mid-size mammal populations, rabbits, opossums, occasionally house cats, reported by residents in the immediate drainage easement area over the following 18 months, the kind of prey-based disruption a large ambush predator produces without ever being seen doing it. A python doesn't leave a crime scene. It leaves a gap where the wildlife used to be. The skeptic's objection: reticulated pythons are tropical animals with essentially zero documented cold tolerance, making winter survival in Appalachian foothill temperatures, which regularly drop into the 20s, implausible for more than a single season. That objection largely holds, and it's the reason this case sits in the middle of the escalation rather than at either end. One winter of survival is not the same claim as an established population, but one winter is also all it takes for an unconfirmed sighting to become a local legend. And legend is exactly where this investigation is headed. Case 5. The hybrid super python dispersing by water. Officially, hybridization in the Florida invasive python population is a matter of settled genetic record, not speculation. A genetic study led by USGS researchers published in the late 2010s confirmed interbreeding between Burmese and Indian pythons within the Everglades population, producing offspring with measurably different behavioral and dispersal characteristics than either parent line. What is not on any agency's radar is where that hybrid lineage goes next. The mechanism is hydrological. Snakes are competent swimmers, and pythons in particular have been tracked using river and canal systems as active dispersal corridors rather than barriers, moving faster and farther along a connected waterway than they would through unbroken forest. The Appalachian River system, the Chattahoochee, the Savannah, the Upper Tennessee watershed, offers exactly that kind of connective tissue, threading from the Georgia coastal plain through Piedmont reservoirs directly into foothill country. A tagged individual from an unrelated Everglades telemetry study tracked by University of Florida researchers between 2015 and 2017 was recorded covering more than 21 miles of linear waterway distance in under 6 weeks. A single animal using a single connected drainage system with no forest crossing required at all. Extrapolate that rate of movement across a multi-generational hybrid population with documented enhanced dispersal behavior over a decade, along a river system that runs from python-positive territory into the Appalachian foothills, and the geography stops being a barrier and starts being a highway. Picture the watershed the way you'd picture a subway map instead of a road map. The water doesn't need to touch every neighborhood to connect them. It just needs one uninterrupted line running through the ones that matter. The skeptic's objection here is the sharpest of the season. Hybrid vigor documented within the Everglades population is not evidence that hybrid individuals have successfully traveled or established outside it. Genetic studies measure what exists within their sampled range, not what has left it. That's a fair and necessary limit on the claim. No hybrid specimen has been genetically confirmed north of the Piedmont. Not enough to confirm the corridor is being used. Not enough to dismiss that the corridor exists and is, on paper, entirely usable. Case 6. Native species misidentification. Here the official position deserves to lead, because on this case, it is very likely the closest to correct one of the 7. State herpetologists across the Appalachian Range report a consistent, well-documented phenomenon. Eastern rat snakes, in the near-total absence of natural predators in altered suburban and agricultural landscapes, regularly reach lengths of 6 to 7 feet, occasionally approaching 8, sizes far outside what most residents expect from a native snake, and large enough to trigger giant python reports that are almost always on investigation, exactly what the agency says they are. The mechanism is perceptual, not biological. A startled homeowner, an unfamiliar species, a size wildly outside personal expectation, and a smartphone photo taken from 20 feet away at a bad angle combine reliably to produce a report of something far more exotic than what's actually present. This is not fringe skepticism. It is the standard, well-supported explanation for the overwhelming majority of giant snake calls that Appalachian wildlife offices field every single year, and it should be weighted accordingly. A documented 2022 case in Blount County, Tennessee, involved a landowner's report of an 8-foot python in a barn loft, which state wildlife responders identified on-site within minutes as an unusually large eastern rat snake, a resolution that almost certainly applies to a large share of the season's less detailed sightings, including some that got folded into the folklore this investigation covers next. The physical evidence, where it exists, tends to confirm the mundane explanation more often than not. Scale pattern photography and shed skin analysis from a sample of regional giant snake reports over the past 5 years found the substantial majority resolved to native species, most commonly oversized rat snakes. The honest skeptic's position, stated plainly and without a counter this time. Most of what feeds Appalachian giant snake folklore is very probably exactly what agencies say it is. A native animal, misjudged. But most is doing careful work in that sentence, not all. A misidentification rate that explains 8 sightings in 10 does not require it to explain the other 2. And it is the residue, not the resolved majority, that the next case is built on. Case 7. Folklore against the modern record. The official position doesn't formally engage with folklore at all, and that's not a failure of the agencies. It's simply outside their mandate. Local legend of an outsized, unidentified serpent moving through remote Appalachian hollows predates any exotic pet trade, predates any climate-driven range expansion, predates every mechanism this investigation has examined. Versions of it recur across the region going back generations, folded into the same oral tradition that produced most regional cryptid lore, inherited, embellished, and, by any conventional standard, dismissible as exactly that. Except that in the past decade, citing reports that echo that older folklore, a snake described as far too large, far too heavy-bodied, and far too patterned to be a native species, have not declined the way you'd expect an aging folk legend to decline. They have, in several counties, informal tracking, mildly increased, clustering disproportionately in the same river corridor and flood-adjacent counties. This investigation has already connected to 6 independent, evidence-based mechanisms. That is either a coincidence or it is the oldest layer of evidence in this entire case, encoded in a form nobody thought to formally check against the newer data until the newer data existed to check it against. It was never a monster. That was never the claim. It may simply have been the closest word a pre-scientific community had for an animal that didn't fit any category they'd been given. And every generation since has kept the word without keeping the investigation. The skeptic's objection is, appropriately, the final word this case deserves. Folklore is not evidence. Sighting reports are not specimens. And pattern matching between old legend and new anecdote is exactly the kind of confirmation bias a rigorous investigation should resist, not lean into. That's correct, and this investigation isn't asking anyone to treat legend as proof. It's asking why 6 unrelated, independently documented, scientifically unremarkable mechanisms, climate, flooding, microclimate refugia, suburban escape corridors, river-borne hybrid dispersal, and a documented pattern of undercounted misidentification all happen to terminate in the same geography an older story already pointed to, long before any of those mechanisms existed to explain it. Appalachian forest cover runs across more than 200,000 square miles. State wildlife monitoring budgets stretched across native species management, hunting regulation, and endangered species recovery allocate a vanishingly small fraction of that coverage to actively searching for an animal every official map says isn't there. A search that was never conducted cannot produce a negative result. It can only produce silence, and silence has been mistaken for an answer in every one of these 7 cases. The volunteer who found the breached enclosures in that flooded outbuilding filed her report in September 2024. As of this recording, no formal wildlife survey of that property or the surrounding river corridor forest has been conducted. The 4 unaccounted-for animals remain, on paper, unaccounted for. Not confirmed dead, not confirmed alive, not confirmed anywhere at all. Somewhere in that same watershed, this winter, something with a body built to wait is either finding shelter deep enough to survive the cold, or it isn't. Nobody is checking. Not enough to confirm it made it. Not enough to dismiss that it could have.